Well, everybody, we are in the midst of the Season of Discovery Phase 4 PTR, and while there's been a lot of interesting changes like class changes, items, you name it, what I am most interested in are the raids that are coming. That's Molten Core, Onyxia, and it looks like we're all going to get a chance to do Azure Ghost Kazakh, maybe even another raid if you believe the rumors. What I'm focused on right now is making sure that my raid has the best chance to succeed in these raids coming up and throughout the rest of Season of Discovery. So let's dive into what our raid comp looks like, some of the changes that are going to affect that, and some general tips around how to rebuild your raid since everybody left this dead game. Let's dive into it.
You are not prepared.
Like with any videos I'm doing during the PTR and ramping up to Phase 4, I do want to put a big disclaimer out there that all of this information is only accurate as of the date this has been recorded, which I'll put down below. There may be more changes, there may be none that are coming, we don't know that yet, so let's just look at things as they stand now, and if things change in the future, I'll do an update video to make sure that we cover everything substantial. I do want to make one other comment before going into this video. Forming a raid and having a good raid comp can be a touchy subject because it's inevitable that someone is going to get their feelings hurt. So do remember, there's a person behind the keyboard on the other side. Don't insult an individual just because they aren't playing the right class, the right spec. When I talk about the raid comp in this video here, this is kind of an ideal case. This isn't what my raid's going to look like, but if I'm building a raid from scratch and I have all the classes and all the specs at my disposal, this is what I would think about. But no one's raid is perfect. You're probably not going to look like what I'm proposing here, and that's okay. We're going to be able to clear all the content regardless. It's more important, in my opinion, to make sure you have strong players rather than the right comp. That said, I'm sure that'll flare up a lot of comments, so please leave a comment below, tell me how I'm wrong. I love the community engagement. Let's dive into the different roles, and I'll give you my take on where they stand now looking at Phase 4, and also some of my own personal philosophies around raid leading. Let's talk about tanks. One thing I'm really happy about is from a tweet that Agrant, the lead SoD dev, put out the other day, which I'll put up here, saying that more or less, and I'm paraphrasing, all tanks will be viable in this content. That's a big deal to me because I think it's important that no one gets excluded because of what they chose 6 months ago now as their tank spec, and not everybody's ready to flip-flop from one to the other. Heck, with things like PvP and rep grinds, no one wants to change their mains at this point. Maybe you've built up a few, and more power to you. But at this point here, I think it's a really good design change that they've made to make sure that everyone like Warlock tanks be able to do fire damage in Molten Core. That's a big deal, and I don't think that should be understated. I do have some opinions about what the best tanks are going to be. And really, I think it's going to be rogues. This may be a shock to you, it may not, but I've been running with a rogue tank for the last 2 phases, and it trivializes so much content. They just don't take physical damage. It's crazy. And if you look ahead to the set bonuses on the rogues tier 1 set, they're going to be taking even less damage because now they can get 50% magic damage immunity. That's wild. They're going to be able to tank everything. Now add in the health bonuses they're getting from rolling with the punches, along with more DPS from Blade Dance, tank rogues are going to be a beast. I think everybody should be running a tank rogue in the raid as their main tank. If I didn't have a rogue available though, I'd be looking at Warlocks since they generate ridiculous amounts of threat, which is going to become a concern not too far from now with warriors and their world buffs. Druids are also going to be a great option because they have an incredible amount of health. They're going to be pumping out more threat with some of the recent changes, and they're just going to be fantastic options too, especially as an off tank. But I'm going to talk about off tanks in just a moment here. Then we have Shaman tanks and Paladin tanks. They're going to be viable. They'll be okay. I think they're a little behind where everybody else is, but they'll probably be better once we have like the tier sets out there and more of an idea of what they're going to be look like when they're geared for Molten Core. But Warriors are one I want to give a little bit of attention to. Warrior tanks are going to be great, especially with the major cooldown for Shield Wall and other enhancements they have for like Thunderclap hitting 10 targets. But Warriors overall, I have a little bit of a problem with because I do believe DPS Warriors are going to outshine all the Warriors, and I'd rather have a tank that doesn't take damage like a rogue than have a warrior in there when I can just have another DPS warrior cranking on the meters. So that's a hot take. That's my personal opinion on all and why I don't want to bring any warrior tanks at this point. I think they're just better served as DPS. However, comment below. I want to hear everybody's opinions on this one. I have a feeling I'll be wrong in the long run, but that's where I'm at today. But that said, bring anything you have for a tank. Anyone who's tanking now, anybody who's geared up and tanking Sunken Temple right now will probably be just fine. I wouldn't worry too much about having a optimized tank, building one up from scratch right now. But that said, if you have a rogue who's been keeping a set off on the side, might be time to tap him for those first few resets at least. And that brings me to one other topic about tanking I want to discuss, and that's off tanks. And this is something that I've observed myself doing pugs, and I think it's kind of ludicrous, the concept of a dedicated off tank in this day and age. We have dual spec, we have many classes that can tank. Don't stay in your tank spec if you're not tanking. In fact, the idea of an off tank, in my opinion, is just outdated. To go our main tank, a rogue named Jeffro, everybody who wears plate is a tank, and druids too if they shift into bear form. That's my preferred way to think about off-tanking. Now, in a tank where you really need a dedicated off-tank, like on Dream Scythe and Weaver and Sunken Temple, have somebody who has some tank abilities, tank gear ready to go. But that should just be a dual spec swap. That should just be maybe putting on a couple different sets of gear. In fact, when it's me, I just put on gloves with a taunt rune on it as a paladin, and I'm good to go. So think about your off-tanking in a way that it's there when you need it, but don't always stay in it. I can't believe how many pugs have these dedicated off tanks that are just sucking air out of the whole raid when they're not tanking for those 5 or 10 minutes they are. And I trash everybody. Pop Righteous Fear if you're a paladin. Go into bear form and taunt if you see something running wild. Anyways, that's my rant about off tanking. Let's move on. Now, if you're anything like me, finding healers that'll show up raid to raid can be a bit of a challenge, although right now we've got a great group of healers and I love you guys. But that said, I am not particularly concerned about the composition of healers, although I don't want too many holy paladins. One really is enough there. When it comes to priest, discipline, and holy, when it comes to mages or druids, grab the best you can and get your healing crew sorted out as soon as possible and really make sure they are feeling appreciated by your raid. It's important to keep them in the loop because when they see people talking about parsing on the meters, or they see tanks who naturally get a ton of glory from tanking the raid, make sure your healers feel appreciated, and that's super important. Now, in a little bit, when I go through what my ideal comp would be for healers in a raid, I actually don't really have one. Currently, I'm running with a paladin, 2 priests, and if we feel like we want to add a 4th for the next phase, it'll probably be a paladin right now. I'm not jury's still out on what we're going to do for that, but finding things like a resto druid's proven to be difficult. Mages, I think there's better DPS than they are healers personally, although maybe in a pinch we'll have one swap. But overall, grab what you have, go for the best healers you can find, the best players you can find. You'll get much better mileage out of that than you will obsessing over the right comp, and if you get someone who maybe is a little uncomfortable in that spec or unfamiliar with it and maybe not really dedicated to learning how to play their healing class properly. So that's food for thought there, but healers, love your healers. Please give them all kinds of love and praise. They deserve it. Now, when I'm forming a raid and I'm thinking about DPS, I'm thinking about 2 things. One is, can they pump? Can they actually do DPS and kill some bosses? That's the most important thing for DPS. And the other thing is, how does it fit into the raid overall? What kind of buffs are we getting? What does the comp look like? Are we balanced? Are we going to go with a little imbalance? So I'm going to go through right now where my raid currently stands for who I know is going to be here for phase 4. A few slots I have open that I'm trying to figure out who the last few are and talk about why I'm making the decisions I'm doing, because I think it's a pretty balanced raid and these decisions should be able to work for anybody in any raid. Let's go over to the raid composition tool. So here's what my raid currently looks like for everybody I have locked in for phase 4. And if you look at this, it's fairly balanced with a few gaps in there. So let's go talk about what I'm looking at to fill those gaps and also how the balance plays in. First off, we run a melee heavy crew, so I need a feral druid in every group for wild strikes. So with that being the case, we have 2 feral druids, we have 2 marksman hunters giving true shot aura to the teams, and also a rogue who's our main tank in one of these groups, along with 2 fury warriors who are just pumpers. Now, aside from that, we have 1 spare slot there. What am I looking to put in there? Another rogue. The reason for that is we want to be able to stack all the poisons we can in order to maximize our abilities with that. Also, having a tank where we get improved exposed armor from him, so that's really nice too. But that covers all the bases for the debuffs we get from poisons. I think that's really great. Rounding out our melee groups, we have 2 retribution paladins. Now, not everybody's going to bring 2. I know that's just where we're at with my raid. These are 2 of our most loyal raiders. I am one of them. On top of that, having 2 rets is a little nice with the tier 1 bonus where every seal on the boss also applies Seal of the Crusader. So we can have 1 putting light, 1 putting wisdom, and then we have some nice health and mana regen throughout the entire fight. So it's something to consider there too. So that's what our melee groups look like. Are they optimal? They're okay. Could we be better? Yeah, I think stacking more warriors in the long run are going to be better. Once we see warriors with world buffs on the PTR, I do expect them to run all the way to the top of the meters and crush everybody, as warriors do, because warriors always find a way to crush. So we'll see how things look then. But for now, this is who I have, and these are raiders I've been raiding with a long time. I trust this crew, and we're going to perform. So going from the top down, we're starting with a Warlock. Now, Warlocks are going to be very desirable to have in a raid because their curses are now going to bring 11% spell damage to a target with a curse on it. That's pretty huge. That's almost like having a Nightfall in your raid. Now, that being the case, do you need more than 1? No. Would you want more than 1? Probably, because Warlocks are also pretty decent. So having 1 in there for that 11% spell damage increase, yeah, you want that all day long. Aside from that, just looking at what's happening on the PTR, mages are pumping. So having multiple mages in your raid is going to be great, especially when it can flex to a healer in case you have someone sick or something like that. So looking at that slot, a 3rd mage might fit right in. If that last slot ends up being another mage, yeah, I'm going to be pretty happy about that. And then we have a Shadow Priest at the end. Shadow Priests are also pumping on the PTR, and also they bring things like Homunculus, which we know well at this point in this phase. We want to have that in our raids. So there's always going to be a slot for a Shadow Priest potentially too, or maybe later on if we drop a healer, we could have a priest swap over to a Shadow spec and have another Shadow Priest that can pump. So Shadow Priest very much in demand have at least one in your raid. Looking at group 4, we have another warlock there. He's actually going to be our off tank for a lot of things. However, he'll be in a DPS spec. I don't want to, just like I was talking about earlier. And aside from that, these are the healers we have right now. We've got 2 great priests and a great holy paladin. Can't complain about that. I am considering for the first few resets in that last slot to put another healer, however, just because thinking back to the beginning of Phase 3, Sunken Temple was really overtuned, so having another healer might smooth out a few bumps along the way, especially if we're going to see our DPS carried by our warriors and mages just pumping at the top of the meters. So jury's still out on that one. I'm waiting for a little more to develop on the PTR and maybe get an idea for what Molten Core looks like, but ideally I'd put a druid in there. That would be probably the best class we could put in there for it. However, they're hard to find. If you're playing a resto druid, please inquire within if you need a raid spot. That said, I would take another priest. Another holy paladin, yeah, not the end of the world, but not the ideal choice I think here. If you found a really decked out healing mage, they could fit in this spot just fine too. So that's how I'm looking at my raid going forward, and I think overall this is a pretty balanced setup here. I do think the game favors melee overall, but there's an investment you need to make with melee to make it work, and that's mostly in the form of feral druids. We're fortunate to have 2. If I only had 1, I might start thinking about how do I fit more casters in. They're a little less dependent on other classes within their party to really perform, so there might be some goodness there. Overall, let's fill in the rest of this chart here. So let's say we do manage to find a druid for resto. Let's see, we add let's add another mage in here. And again, with Molten Core having reduced immunities or no immunities for fire, unlike an original classic, fire mages are going to pump right off the bat. We're going to see all kinds of hijinks with them. And then let's add in for our last slot, let's add in another rogue so we can cover all those poisons just to see what it looks like. And to me, when I look at this is a very good and balanced raid comp. So is this what my raid is going to look like? Probably not. I'll probably end up with 2 holy paladins to start just because that's who I have. But that said, this is what I would strive for. If I'm looking to recruit, that's when you can get picky and you can try to find things like that resto druid if you want to find someone fresh to your guild or to your raid. Think about that too. There are going to be opportunities. There's always opportunities to find people to play with in this game. I'm happy to go into Molten Core and Ani and all the other stuff with this group here. I think this is going to be a group that's going to have a lot of success. Now, will your raid look like this? Probably not. No 2 raids really seem to look alike. You may have 2 caster groups instead of 2 melee groups, and that's fine. I think that's going to have no trouble in Molten Core and Ani. You're going to be just fine if you have a bunch of casters. Don't even worry about it. What I really want people to take away from this, though, is when you're forming your raid groups, really pay attention to the raid buffs that are available, the group party-wide buffs versus the raid-wide buffs, and things like that new warlock change. It's really going to be a big increase in DPS for your casters, so consider that as well. That said, is there any other things we can do to tweak this raid as it stands now to make it better? Potentially. Earlier I mentioned the Nightfall Axe, for instance. Once we know what the revamped version of that looks like for the stats, then we might actually have some people who want to swing Nightfall, and that would be another boon to your casters as well, especially if you're running a caster heavy raid. That's worth considering as well. It's going to be expensive, I'm sure, but give it some thought. It's an option out there to increase your overall raid DPS. Now, if you're a horde raider, you'll notice I didn't talk about Shaman at all, mostly because I just don't have much experience with them in Season of Discovery. However, it sounds like you're probably going to stack a lot of Elemental Shaman instead, maybe instead of a second melee group, so consider that as well as you go and look at the raid you're forming. I'll leave that for anyone who wants to make any comments below about what Shaman do bring to the raid and how best to form them, because I'm just not the expert there personally. So aside from raid comp and classes and all that stuff, one other thing to talk about really quick is about kind of the meta conditions around a raid, which are things like your loot rules and what's happening with legendaries. Going into raids like Molten Core and Onyxia, people take them a little bit more seriously and people a little bit more eager to make sure they know where they stand when it comes to loot and everything. So I think it's really important to communicate with your raid. First off, if you're going to go to a different loot system, I'll be going to Loot Council in these raids just because it's a little easier to distribute loot in a fair manner, assuming you're not completely corrupt. But also, legendaries are going to be a contentious point because a lot of people feel they're entitled to them. So my philosophy is legendaries are like trophies. Sure, for some people they're going to be their best, and you want to make sure that the best gear goes in the hands of the best players. But with the legendaries in this phase, do keep in mind there is a heavy crafting cost associated with them, and unless your guild is going to come together to craft it for them, there's going to be a lot of cost on the person who gets it, and you want to make sure the people who get things like the bindings and the eye from Ragnaros are able to actually craft that weapon. You don't want to see that item just sitting in their bank for phases to come. So make sure people know up front what the expectations are. On a similar note, consider doing the same thing with crafting items. Things like lava cores, fiery cores. There's going to be in high demand by pretty much everybody. And the stance I've taken in phase 3 with the seeds and with the Atali Mojos, I've just been distributing those evenly at the raid. Heck, at this point we have so many, we're just rolling them off. And I'm going to probably continue doing something like that in the next phase as well. If there's a need for someone to really gather a lot to craft something, we might ask people if they want to contribute to that. We don't want things like that to really get in the way of the success of a raid. Also, being able to sell those things is really nice because flasks are going to be expensive, repairs are expensive, all the other consumes are expensive, so giving people a way to get some income while raiding is pretty nice. I hope you found this video at least a little entertaining, if not informative. In my next video, there'll be the last in this prep series, where I'll be talking about changes on the PTR, some more data mining that goes on closer to the release of Phase 4, and maybe even talk about things like if we have multiple difficulties for the raids, like a heroic and mythic molten core, who would think that would be a thing? So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more, subscribe, notify, you know the drill for YouTube stuff, and please leave comments below. I know I missed a lot of stuff. There's things I glazed over in all my videos that are probably very helpful for people, so make a comment. I love seeing the engagement, and I really read all the comments, so please feel free to say whatever you like. And looking ahead past the season discovery prep, I have a lot of ideas for things to do once we are raiding and show how some things have gone and changed over time from my surely misguided preconceptions here before the phase is out to what actually happens when the phase begins. That said, everybody, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.